Today we're looking at in-ear monitors versus bass amps. We'll look at the pros and cons of each and what's best for you depending on the gigs and situations you find yourself in and what level you're at in your bass journey. Also, stick around to the end as I'm going to give you 8 questions you can ask yourself to know whether it's worth you buying both or not. Let's kick things off with in-ear monitors as they've become increasingly popular among bass players for several reasons. And I know many of you are also going to ask about the in-ears that I've used, so I've included the link in the description below to the in-ears that I'm currently using, which I am loving a lot. Now let's get into it. The first pro of in-ear monitors is sound clarity. You can hear every nuance of your bass playing, allowing you to dial in your tone precisely. Sometimes what you hear on stage is very different to what they're pumping out front of house, and I really like to hear the shape of the bass sound, and in-ears really help with this. Pro number 2 is isolation. They give you great noise isolation, cutting out stage noise and preserving your hearing, especially if you have custom molds as well. Pro number 3 is customization. Now, depending on your setup, in-ears allow you to have more control over your mix by adjusting the balance between, say, your bass and the vocals and all the other instruments. An example of this is I personally like to turn up the kick drum probably louder than the guitar player because sometimes those lower frequencies can sound muddy depending on the room and stage that you're playing in. Pro number 4 is they're super compact and easy to transport, making them ideal for tours and shows where you're traveling a lot. Let's move on to the cons of in-ear monitors. So number 1 is probably the initial cost. I personally don't think it's worth getting cheap in-ear monitors. If you are going to do it, I'd save up and invest in high quality ones, which means they can be expensive, especially if you go for custom molded models. Con number 2 is the learning curve. It can take some time to get used to the feeling of isolation because your bass sounds very exposed when you have your in-ears in, and not everyone enjoys that. Con number 3 is dependency on technology. Now, this has actually happened to me before where you have no amps on stage and you're only using in-ears and they fail halfway through the song. It was actually the equipment that failed, but that's besides the point. Because then you're just left with the sound that's on stage, and because there's no amps or monitors on stage, that can be really tough. Now, before we dive onto bass amps, I just want to quickly mention if you're a bass player who's past the absolute beginner phase, but now you feel stuck at this frustrating kind of intermediate plateau and you're not quite sure how to get to the next level of your bass playing, I've actually created a free masterclass for you, which you can check out at freebasslesson.com or just click the link in the description below. Let's get back into it. Now let's shift our focus to bass amps. I'm going to try to not be biased here because I'm super old school and I love bass amps, but let's first look at the pros. Now, before I dive into that, again, many of you are going to ask about what amps I use, so I've included links in the description below to the amps I'm currently using, but for most of my professional career, I've preferred Mark bass amps, but of course on some gigs you just get what you're given on the night. So I do think it's worth getting comfortable with a range of different amps. The first pro is feel. My favorite thing about bass amps is that you can physically feel the bass vibrations and the air going through a good sized amp, which helps me really connect to the instrument when playing. Number 2 is stage presence. Amps provide stage presence and character to your sound, which can be essential in certain genres and live situations. Pro number 3 is reliability and setup time. Now, amps are generally more reliable than in-ears just because there's less tech involved. In-ears usually take longer to set up and get everyone's mix right, but then on the other hand, most people have preset mixes, so you can have a more consistent sound for each gig when playing in different venues every night if you are using in-ears. Now let's look at the cons of bass amps. Number 1 is volume and control. Amps might not provide the same level of control over your sound compared to in-ears, especially in larger venues. Number 2 is stage volume. In smaller venues or with bands that play loudly, the stage volume from your amp can sometimes be a problem for both your hearing, but also less flexibility when it comes to isolating certain instruments and getting that perfect mix. Here's one quick tip for you if you can't hear very well on stage. I like to be able to see the kick drum to help me stay locked in, especially when the sound is muddy, because you can usually hear the snare and the hats, but the kick sometimes gets missed if you're playing bass and the sound is really bad. So the big question remains, do you need both in-ear monitors and a bass amp? Of course, it depends on your gigs and personal preferences, but here are 8 questions you can ask yourself to determine whether it's worth buying both in-ear monitors and a bass amp. But before I dive into that, I'm curious, if you could only choose one, which one would you pick? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Question 1 is, what genre do I primarily play? Is the music genre more suited to the precise, isolated sound of in-ears, or does it rely on the stage presence provided by a bass amp? Question 2 is, how loud does my band play? Does your band have a high energy, loud stage presence where a bass amp is kind of essential, like a rock or heavy metal band, for example? Or do you perform in quieter settings where in-ear monitors would help with the isolation of sound? Question 3, do I frequently record or play in studios? Is recording an important part of your music career? If so, in-ears can be very valuable for critical listening during studio work, but to be honest, when I'm recording, as you can probably see in my previous videos, I prefer more of the over-the-ear headphones, kind of like these. Question 4, how much control over my monitor mix do I want to have? Are you very particular about your monitor mix? If so, in-ear monitors offer more control, while relying solely on bass amps means you're trusting the sound of the engineer. And if you've been playing long enough, I'm sure you've come across your fair share of good, but also bad sound engineers. Question number 5 is, am I concerned about hearing protection? Is protecting your hearing a priority? I have slight tinnitus in my ears, so for me, using in-ears, or if I'm just using an amp, using earplugs helps protect my hearing from further damage. Question 6, do I need a backup system? If you're on a high pressure gig, having a backup in case of a technical failure can be very useful. This is where having both in-ears and an amp can be a great solution. Question 7 is, what is my budget for gear? If you're just getting started and you're a complete beginner, I'd recommend buying a bass amp first. I don't think you need both unless you're performing regularly. Consider your financial situation and prioritize based on your immediate needs. And question number 8 is, what are my personal preferences? Ultimately, do you prefer the traditional feel and stage presence of an amp, or do you embrace the modern convenience and precision of in-ear monitors? Because I believe your comfort and enjoyment while performing does matter a lot. Hey, have you checked out this video on my channel yet? Because in this video, I show you how to remove the bass from the original recording of any song using a simple app, so you can create custom bassless backing tracks. Click the video you see on the screen now, and I'll see you there.